changed, and he smiled broadly. "Why, bless me, I'm talking to you as though your destiny was bound up in the United States, and you were going back there next week. When, as a matter of fact, we are both of us absolutely cut off, and that country is no more to us than the lost Atlantis or other such fabled cities. Come, I don't know how you feel, but this great outflow of words seems to have left a void that reminds me that it is about the hour for lunch." Stepping to the ubiquitous transmitter, he gave some orders about a carriage, and I heard him say something about a two-seater at the hour of 14. Passing out of the building, we walked through the handsome grounds of Capitol Square, and had barely reached the boulevard that surrounded it when a light carriage came whizzing down upon us, in which we took our seats and were propelled swiftly to my friend's house in suburbs. "I've been greatly interested in what you have told me about your government," I said as we rode along, "but one thing you did not explain I would like to know, and that is how the lots are cast which elects one man to office out of the great number of candidates." "And now," said my friend, "by a fortunate circumstance you can have an opportunity of seeing just how it is done, as a magistrate has recently resigned in one of the commonwealths of this province to accept a position in the sub-treasury at Agia to the province of Vandalia. And if you remember, there was an item in the news current this morning which stated that an election would be held tomorrow to fill the vacancy occasioned by the supervisor taking his place. It is only about an hour's run on the Ironia and Olympian Rail, and you can go down and see for yourself, which would be better than any description you could have given of it. It was accordingly arranged that I should run down the next morning and take it in. When we arrived at the house of my friend, I found a gentleman waiting for me with a tape line and a book of cloth samples, who was introduced as a very capable furnisher. I learned that my host had asked him to call and take my measure for an outfit. I went up to my room with the outfitter and was surprised at the excellent quality of his samples, there being no shoddy or inferior goods in the lot. I intimated to him that as I had a very complete wardrobe, and as the period of my sojourn in that country was uncertain, I did not desire anything expensive, preferring something rather of good appearance without regard to durability. The smiling tailor told me, though, that he had no goods that would not wear for years, all being equally well made, and the only difference being in the weight of the material. Inspecting a piece of black cashmere, I asked him if he could guarantee the dye to retain a luster, and to my astonishment was informed that he did not handle any dyed clothes at all, everything he had being in the natural color of the wool, which included every shade of handsome suitings, of the finest and firmest texture. Remarking the excellence of the quality, I volunteered the compliment that his factories evidently turned out better goods than ours, whereupon he informed me that every piece was woven by hand, and that there was not a cloth factory in the Republic. In the meantime, I had made my selection, and he was engaged in taking my measure. "Do you mean to tell me," I asked with astonishment, "that a nation so far advanced as yours does not use any machinery in the manufacturing of clothes?" "None at all," was the reply. "They used to, long before my time, but under the Republic no factories are allowed." "And do you weave this cloth, or do you have to go around and find it among the private individuals who weave it?" I asked. "Oh, I simply go to the government exchange, which takes it from the weavers, and I get what I want." "Does the government speculate in this cloth, or simply store it and sell it for the weavers?" "The government does not speculate on anything," replied the outfitter. "It takes this cloth, giving the weaver in exchange the price established by the Bureau of Subsistence, which is based on the weight and weave of the goods. It is then sold to whomever wants it at a slight advance, which is the seigniorance or principal source of revenue for the support of the state. Then there is no competition, I remarked. I suppose the prices for the different grades are purely arbitrary with this bureau. No, the price of nothing is arbitrary, returned the tailor, the value of everything being fixed by the average cost of production as ascertained by the Bureau in the most careful and scientific manner. There must be, said I, some unsaleable goods made, as there is in my country. Does the exchange have to take them at the production price, regardless of what they will sell for? The exchange sometimes has goods that will not sell for the established price by reason of their undesirability, damage in storage, or other causes. When that is the case, they are cut to the selling point. It frequently happens, too, especially with agricultural productions, that the price of one article is reduced, while that of other things which compete with it or displace it are raised. The Bureau has all of that in hand, and the business is reduced to a science. The exchange also has the right to reject anything, and so producers keep in touch with it and thus know what the public demand is for it. Here was another field opened up to my curiosity, which I would have liked very much to explore by further questioning, but my outfitter did his work expeditiously, and lunch was waiting. At the table, I introduced the subject and asked why the manufacture of cloth by machinery was prohibited by the Iron Republic. We prohibit the use of machinery in the making of cloth, answered my host, for the same reason that we do in the manufacture of everything else that the people can supply without the aid of machinery. That is, that there may be work for all. Do I understand that you have no manufactories at all? I asked. Not that we have none at all, but none for the manufacture of any article that can be applied on sufficient quantity to meet demand, without the use of machinery. This list includes fabrics of almost every description, shoes, hats, headwear, furniture, rope, agricultural implements and products, vehicles, in fact, almost everything that we use. And the purpose of this is that there may be work for all to do? Oh, that is the purpose, replied my host, and the purpose is accomplished, for as it requires the work of all to supply the wants of all, there is no enforced idleness in this republic. But I said, with a disposition to argue every point, one man with a machine can do the work of 100, and it seems to me that with your admirable political conditions you might well enjoy the use of machinery, thereby giving the people more time for recreation and the improvement of the mind. Well, certainly there is a great temptation to use a machine that will do the work of 100 men, replied my host. And if the 100 men were the beneficiaries of its efficiency, there could be no excuse for not using it. You employ labor-saving machinery in the United States, and where it does the work for 100 or 1,000 men, do they get the benefit of it? I could not say that they did. As a matter of fact, continued my host, does anybody derive any benefit except the owners of the machine? I was obliged to confess that they were the only direct beneficiaries, but that the cost of production was lessened, which of course must be to the advantage of all. Ah, my friend, exclaimed the professor, I very much fear that your argument is influenced by your legal training, for it is palpably one-sided, being predicated on the assumption that a machine doing the work of 100 men lessens the price of its products without diminishing the purchasing power of the 100 men who have been deprived of work by it. Now, let us come down to practical illustration. You use machinery in the manufacture of shoes. To what extent does it lessen labor and cost? Well, very much indeed, I answered, warming up to the advantage I thought that I saw. With improved machinery and a division of labor, I have been informed that a man can make a pair of shoes every 7 minutes at a cost of 30 cents. Very well. If you are not positive, though, as to the accuracy of your data, we will allow some latitude and say they make a pair in 12 minutes at a cost of 50 cents. That will be 50 pairs in a day of 10 hours. Your man with the machine, then, has done the work of 50 men. What pay does he receive? From the best of my information, an average of about $2 per day, I replied. Your man is paid $2 a day and turns out a product that sells for $25 in... Oh, no, I interrupted. That costs $25 to make. I see, I said to my host, smiling. This is the cost of making. Now, what do the shoes sell for? I should say an average of $1.50. Ah, then this man does the work of 50 men and turns out a product that is worth $100 more than the cost of production. Who gets this $100? Asked my host, laying down his fork and looking across the table at me with an air of affected simplicity. The man or the company that owns the machine. I suppose, I answered, slightly nettled. Then the 49 men whose work has been done for them not to come in except in the manner of increased time for recreation. But what surprises me most, my host went on, is that these shoes can be made for 50 cents and should be sold for $1.50. How is this feat so contrary to the laws of competition accomplished? In the first place, I answered, our manufacturers combine to maintain prices among themselves, and in the second place, we have a tariff which brings the imported article up to that price. So, exclaimed my host, I begin to comprehend your system, which I presume was the same when I left the country, but as I was quite a young man and had never paid much attention to such matters, I retained no knowledge on the subject. Now, let us look into this system in its practical application. Here's a machine that in one day, with the application of one man's labor, does the work of 50 men, thereby depriving 49 men of the opportunity to do work. In the value of the product, it turns out, it earns the wages of 50 men, and yet all that labor gets out of it is the paltry sum of $2, or not enough to pay the result of 15 minutes of its time, the balance going to the owner of the machine. So while flesh and blood and brains and skill earns $2 for a labor, wood and iron and steel earns $50 for capital. And this wonderful machine, too, in all probability, is the product of skill and labor at the same miserable wage. Is this system conducive to an equitable distribution of wealth among the people? Does it not rather impoverish the 49 men whose work is done by the machine, and enrich one man who gets the value of 50 men's work for the price of one? I could not deny so logical a conclusion. Now, in the Iron Republic, continued the professor, where machinery is not allowed to supplant labor, but to produce 50 pairs of shoes in one day, would probably require the work of 50 men, and the value of their product would be divided among them. So the question resolves itself to its proposition. Which is better, to let 50 men earn $1 apiece, or to let 2 men earn $100, one of whom works while the other keeps books, of which amount the working man gets $2, while the bookkeeper gets the other 98, or the balance? The proposition did not admit of debate, but I could not refrain from remarking that it seemed a pity that 50 men should labor a day to accomplish what an inanimate machine might do without toil or fatigue. Well, not necessarily, retorted my host. In appearance, and according to the ethics of industrial economy, there could be no objection to the machine doing the work of 50 men, if the 50 men got the benefit of its work. And yet it is contrary to the divine economy as expressed in the biblical injunction that man shall eat bread by the sweat of his brow, and, like every other human, practice that runs contrary to the divine order is harmful in its results, and I think your system must demonstrate it. Notwithstanding the use of machinery, you doubtless have a large number of men who are steadily and permanently employed now, which makes the best showing, mentally and morally. This steadily employed class, or the unemployed or partially employed class, whose time for recreation and the improvement of the mind has been increased by the use of machinery, I was compelled to confess that the employed class took precedence both in point of intelligence and morals. I remarked, too, that it was a disappointing fact that our public libraries, night schools, and other institutions founded for the benefit and elevation of the masses were least patronized by those of most leisure. It is not strange, said my host, the reasonable employment of the body prepares the mind for recreation. A man's mind, though especially if it be not well cultivated, having nothing to employ it but recreation, grows bad just as most boys do when have nothing to do but play. The universe is founded on a plan, and that plan contemplates that every man shall work. The man who does not suffers, and society suffers by him. There are no exceptions to this rule. I confess that you have had the better of me all along, said I, but you are certainly mistaken when you say that there are no exceptions to this rule, for many of our most intelligent and virtuous men are those who have grown vastly rich from the results of other men's labor. I may say most generous also, for in my country hundreds of churches, colleges, libraries, and other beneficent institutions stand as monuments to this virtue in them today. Undoubtedly, assented the professor, and yet I must remind you that in the first place that a man who becomes a millionaire from the increment of other men's labor can be no idler, for the mere keeping up with his business and getting the lions, tigers, and wolves' share of the product of the labor employed by him will keep him pretty busy. And in the second place, when a man takes gifts with money obtained that way, is such generosity in any manner different than from that of Robin Hood, who robbed one class and gave to another? Is it even as condemnable for the old highwayman invariably took from the rich and gave to the poor, at the worst doing evil that good might come, by contributing to the equalization of wealth, while your millionaires take from the poor and give in such a way as to enhance their reputation, this being the only thing to be desired after having acquired more money than they can use in promoting their pleasures. From my point of view, there is no more generosity in such actions than there was in Trajan's lavish expenditure on his tomb. I think you will find, too, that the sons of these millionaires who inherit the money without the training that came with its accumulation will suffer and make society suffer, thus proving the old Bible doctrine that the sins of the parents are visited on the children unto the third and even fourth generation. That doctrine may be true in theory, I replied, laughing, but in my country the first generation usually exhausts the possibility of the evil by getting rid of the root of it. And as far as the money is itself may contribute directly to the evil, assented my host, but a life of profligacy and dissipation made possible by inherited wealth may leave a train of evils behind it in extending to generations unborn. Then you regard wealth as an evil, do you? I asked. Well, I certainly regard wealth as a most prolific source of evil, and it is acquired in the manner we have been discussing, that is, where a poor man is required to make shoes for a rich man for 50 cents and then pay $1.50 for the same shoes for himself and family to wear it, is an evil per se. You say this is partly the result of legislation, and if it is, yours is a government of the minority, for there must be fewer rich than poor men. I grant what you say, I replied. Government is of, for, and by the rich, always has been, and probably always will be, because wealth is power, but it does not necessarily follow that for that reason it is bad. In the cooperation of mind and matter, in the affairs of human government, as in everything else, mind must predominate. In predominating, it secures the conditions of life most favorable to itself, and thus extends its sphere as an exploring party of a few men, by getting more than their share of food, and are enabled to penetrate faster and further than their comrades. But as they blaze the way they open up, it is easier for the rest to follow, and so I believe the world has been the gainer by the very inequalities and injustice by which you condemn. In its age-long and worldwide advance, the human mind has not marched in phalanx. Under favoring conditions, the strongest and boldest have broken away and led the advance, scaling walls to others, impregnable and climbing heights inaccessible to the average, and placing beacon lights to make the ascent easier for those to follow. "My dear sir," exclaimed the professor, "your figure is very pretty, but I think it is so only because of the beautiful words in which you have clothed it. Skill in the art of dressing may be made to hide many defects," with a sly glance at the ladies, "but I'm not going to be taken in by mere external appearances. It is not your figure I find fault with, but your logic. Let us state your proposition in the form of a syllogism and proceed logically. Major premise. In its advancement, mind will secure itself to the conditions most favorable to its expansion. Minor premise, but wealth is most favorable to the expansion of the mind. Conclusion. It is therefore by the aid of wealth that the human mind has advanced to its present wonderful stage of development. Is this a fair and logical statement of the proposition? And I admitted that it was. Very well then, I dispute your minor premise and deny your conclusion, said my host positively. Wealth is not favorable to the expansion of the mind, and for its wonderful development it acknowledges no financial obligation whatsoever. Under the patronage of wealth, which was to be the gainer by its product, mind has wrought some of its most beautiful creations, and modern times wealth has supplied in some instances tools to facilitate its work. But in the main, money has rather been the enemy of the mind, and wealth, whether supporting monarchical extravagance, religious bigotry, or personal vanity and ambition, has tended to suppress rather than promote the highest and noblest qualities of the human mind. Its sublimest efforts have been achieved in poverty, in exile, in dungeons even. And as for scaling walls impregnable and climbing heights inaccessible, and planting beacon lights for others, as per your pretty figure, the most gifted men have gone to the stake or scaffold, because power, which has always been synonymous with wealth, did not approve. I began to get warm in the collar, for though I had engaged in the discussion more for information than argument, the ease and skill with which my opponent had met and defeated me at every point aroused all of the belligerency of my nature. But what made it more exasperating too, the ladies seemed to be deeply interested listeners and caught every point. Since you have appealed to Caesar, said I, unto Caesar will we go. If you resort to logic, then I will meet you with your own weapon and state another syllogism for you to disprove. Major premise. In all times, wealth and power have been used to repress and retard the development of the mind. Minor premise. But it is in the nature of mind to resist oppression, and its mightiest energies have been aroused in this resistance. Conclusion. Therefore, wealth and power have unwittingly contributed to the development and expansion of the mind. Very neatly turned, cried the professor, while the ladies smiled, and Miss Helen even infringed the neutrality laws by clapping her hands. Then try your position, continued my host. Is that everything which opposes the advancement of the mind really facilitates its development? Not precisely. Everything which arouses the resistance and overcoming instinct of the mind, I returned. The point is well taken and strongly stated, conceded the professor. But what wealth and power has contributed to the development of the mind by such direct oppression as to arouse resistance and wake its slumbering energies is slight in comparison with the blight and stagnation induced by war, financial oppression, and industrial wrongs. You charge these things to wealth, then? I do, most unequivocally, responded my host. Homer would have us believe that the Trojan War was fought for love, but the wars of history have been fought for wealth and power. I make the point on you, I returned, that the poorest nations have been the least intelligent, and that industrial wrongs have always been greatest where ignorance has been grossest. I think that history will sustain me in the further assertion that war has been the great civilizer of the world. Incontrovertible statements, all, asserted my opponent, and incorrect only as they confuse cause and effect. If the poorest nations have been the least intelligent, they were the poorest because they were the least intelligent, and not unintelligent because they were poor. If industrial wrongs have been greatest where ignorance has been most dense, it is simply because the people being ignorant were least able to defend themselves against industrial wrongs. If civilization has been a product of war, it is a byproduct and resulted because, notwithstanding the barbarity and inhumanity of the wars, they brought different peoples together, and the knowledge of different nations by amalgamation was enlarged. War itself is debasing to the human mind. I take issue with you on that, said I hotly. War may be destructive, but it is not debasing. War may be cruel, but cruelty calls forth nobility. War may make widows and orphans, but it also makes heroes, and liberty and patriotism have been fructified by all the blood the earth has ever drunk. And what has been the liberty of the world? My friend asks scornfully. But the illusion which people cherish when they have exchanged one set of masters for another. And what is the patriotism of the world but that savage and senseless prejudice which is cultivated by teaching the fools of nation to hate the fools of other nations? And when the fools of the two nations have been set by the ears by their rulers, they fight and maim and kill, and this is called glorious war. I beg a truce, I cried, seeing that my venerable host felt deeply on the subject, while I was merely endeavoring to hold up my end of the argument. I find that I am no match for you iron republicans. I have only encountered these accomplished ladies, yourself, and Professor Ballum, and on the subjects of dress, industrial economy, and music, I find that I know nothing, am eliminated, obliterated. In other words, to use an Americanism, I am not in it, and hereby surrender foot, horse, and dragoons. I cannot offer you my sword, for I presume there is no such thing in this model republic." "They were all beaten into plowshares long since," answered my friend, smiling good-humoredly, "so that formality will have to be dispensed with. I am generous, though, in victory, and will pay you the compliment to say that if your cause was worthy of your prowess, the result might be different. In all contests, though, the justice of a cause is not less an element of strength than the